Good morning. How is everybody this morning? All right, we're ready for Ecclesiastes 12, and we're going to try to sprint to the finish because next week we have somebody else teaching class. Jim, are you teaching class? Okay, Jim's teaching class. Good, good. I knew I was told, but I couldn't remember if it's you or who it was. Well, that'll be good. All right. But we kind of want to finish Ecclesiastes. Jim teach next week, and then I'll be back Christmas, 25th. We'll start a study of some kind. And so remember that. Solomon is winding up his book in his search. And when you finish reading the book and you finish studying the book, as I was thinking about it sort of this week, kind of thinking back over it, and I don't know that I'd ever really thought about it to this end until the other day, but I don't believe he contradicts himself, but he sure does say one thing out of one side of his mouth and then something out of the other side of his mouth, doesn't he? It's almost like he says, life's vain, life's empty, life's futile, life's worthless. But then there are points in it in the second chapter, the third chapter, the fifth chapter, the eighth chapter, where he talks about joy. He talks about rejoicing. And you look and you say, how in the world can a man that seemingly is, I don't know, disgruntled with life, talk about joy in life? But he does. And so it all depends on how you look at the book, I think. But the way I look at the book of Ecclesiastes might not be necessarily the way you look at the book, but the way I look at the book is I look at a man that is in search for happiness, and he's having difficulty finding it. But in his search, trying to find what means something to him, he says this is all vain. I think it is, as the way I look at it, it's a book probably written in the latter part of his life, but written to his son. Now, maybe he, as we have said before in class, maybe he saw something that in his son that he needed to warn him of, or thought he needed to warn him of, and point him in the right direction. Or maybe it was just due to the fact that this is the way he lived life, and this is what he'd come to. And maybe it's sometimes, let me put it this way, sometimes as we grow older, we get a little more cantankerous in life. And we also, as we look back through life, we look at it with different glasses than we did as we're marching through it. And maybe that's part of it. I don't really know, don't have the answer. But I look at Solomon and I try to pick out the words of wisdom, and yet at the same time too try to figure out where he's coming from. And where he's coming from is really hard. The words of wisdom are good, but where he comes from is really hard. And so if we get time, we'll look at some lessons to remember just overall from the book. But let's look at this 12th chapter. He says, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them, while the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are not darkened and the clouds do not return after the rain. He says, remember God. It's easy, and we're all, older in years, but it's easy when you're younger to get caught up in the events of life. So much is going on. And especially our young adults now, our young parents now. I mean, kids, there's so many different things for kids to do. When I was growing up, I remember in my hometown, I grew up in Milan, Tennessee, a town of about 8,500 approximately at the time. I remember there was summer baseball to be played. And that was about it. And then as I got a little older, though, they introduced flag football. We played, as kids, we played organized flag football. There was really nothing in the winter to do. But then spring would come and summer, or spring and summer, and you would play organized baseball. Well, now there's not just sports, not just baseball and basketball and tennis and golf and football, but kids have camps to go to, theater camps and science camps and math camps and computer camps and groups that go on all year long. These groups, some of them go on all year long, and that's all fine and good. So I'm not saying anything bad about any one of them. I sort of like the attitude that one father had. I was coaching his daughter in soccer, and she was not that good, but she wasn't that bad. And she was a little co-ed team. They were probably 7 or 8 years old. I forgot now how old Ethan was at the time. But anyway, he was introducing her to everything. He said, I want to introduce her to everything and then let her pick what she likes. Now, that's a pretty good way of doing it. Well, a lot of parents are doing that. Well, when they do that, they're getting caught up. And they get caught up in all of these things. And to be honest, the world doesn't care if it happens Sunday morning at 10 o'clock or Saturday afternoon at 3. It doesn't matter to the world. Doesn't matter if it's Wednesday night at 7 or if it's Wednesday afternoon at 2. We get caught up in the event. Well, that's true not just of young parents and their children, but it's true of all of us. We get caught up in doing what's going on. And so it's easy to push God out. And Solomon says, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. Don't get caught up in life and forget God. He says, before the difficult days, the hard days, the challenging days, some versions even say the evil days come, and the years draw near when life says, I have no pleasure in them. You see, life changes. Children grow up. We grow up. And the attitudes that we develop in our younger years carry us then throughout life, right? We develop our attitudes based upon what we're around. We develop our attitudes based upon what we're around with regards to our parents. We develop attitudes based upon what we are around in life, the people we're around, what we associate with, or who we associate with, what we read, who we talk to, what we watch. And we say, well, we like this, and we just get into it further and further and further and further until all of a sudden we're in it and we don't realize it. And our attitude then is formed, and our attitudes are very difficult to change. Not impossible, but very difficult. Usually we don't change our attitudes. Usually we don't change the direction of our life until we really realize we need to change. Well, Solomon, I think, probably had an insight to that. And he says, there's going to come a day in which you're basically going to be caught where you are and what you're doing. And he says, so be careful. He then begins to talk about death, and he really draws an analogy that is interesting. He's going to talk about various things, and most folks believe that he's talking about and trying to picture growing old and dying. So before we get to that, anything anybody like to say? Well, let's look. He begins in verse 3. He says, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble. Now we're just trying to figure out, or I'm trying to figure out, really exactly what Solomon is talking about. And maybe I'm right, and maybe I'm not. I looked through 2-3 different sources, and they seemingly said the same thing, and so we'll go with it. He says, when the days are in the days when the keepers of the house tremble. Maybe he's talking about the arms and the hands begin to tremble. And the strong men bow down, the legs and the knees and the shoulders begin to weaken. When the grinders cease because they are few, in other words, when our teeth begin to fall out, and those that look through the window grow dim, our vision begins to grow dim. When the doors are shut in the streets, not exactly sure, but some have said, when our hearing begins to go, and maybe we even, someone, I believe it was Wiersbe, even said maybe it's even the closing of the mouth because we've lost the teeth. And the sounds of grinding is low when one rises up at the sound of a bird, gets up early, and all the daughters of music are brought low. Voices begin to quiver and to weaken. I've been asked, well, how long are you going to preach? And they're not talking about today, but they're talking about in my lifetime. And I've said one of the answers that I've given is as long as I have my voice in my mind, and my mind's already going. So but as long as I have a voice, and it was interesting back several years ago, preacher of sort of a group that I was in, he retired. He stepped out of full-time preaching, and it wasn't too long before we noticed. And even in a meeting, one guy leaned over to me and he said, I already noticed that his voice is not near as strong as what it used to be. Now, as we grow older, that seems to happen. And he says, beginning in verse 5, and also they are afraid of height. They're afraid of falling and of terrors in the way. Afraid of falling? Who's not? As Suzanne said this morning, she said maybe it was yesterday, just one time going down one accident, if you will, and caused a lot of problems. Yeah. The terrors of the way, and when the almond tree blossoms, and almond trees, when they blossom, are very white. And so maybe he's talking about the hairs turning white. The grasshopper is a burden. That one is hard, and I don't understand it. One guy that I read did suggest, he said, grasshopper will get to where he doesn't hop as far and as high, and his legs, he has to pull them along, those long legs. And he says maybe that's what he's talking about, just the idea of dragging yourself along. Nobody really understood that one. I don't understand it. And he says the desires fail, the loss, of course, of appetite, the loss of maybe even physical desire. For man goes to his eternal home, and mourners go about the street. He says the man goes home, he dies. We grow old and we die. We know that we're not going to live forever. What David reminds us in the book of Psalms, he says that the days of our years are 70 years, and if by reason of strength 80, we're soon cut off and we fly away. We pass away. We know that. How old was Sarah? Miss Sarah, how old was she? 99. The lady that she and her husband lived next door to me growing up, 99 years old, just passed away this week. She had a tremendous impact. She and her husband both had a tremendous impact on my life. Mr. Guy is that was his name, but he had 4 daughters. They were all a whole lot older than I was, but I used to, because my dad worked on Saturdays. And so when I was out of school, a lot of Saturdays I followed Mr. Guy around in the yard and different things. So I was his semi-adopted son. And and he taught me a lot of things. And he was a mighty fine fellow. He died in 2020, right after Mom died. But Miss Sarah, 99 years old, passed away. Well, that's unusual that we live that long, right? We grow old, we die. It's a fact of life. We may not like it. It does get disturbing, though. I try to go back and look at some of the obituaries in some of the funeral homes in places where I've lived occasionally to see, if I know of anybody that's died recently. And you might say, well, that's disturbing. Well, no, you try to find out, where your friends are. And it's disturbing to look at the obituaries, and when you look at them, and biggest portion of them are younger than you are. That begins to make you recognize, I'm on the other side. Well, Solomon says, when all that happens and man goes to his eternal home, but then he says, and I think the telling tale is this last phrase: the mourners go about the street. Life moves on. We grow old. We even grow old to the point of dying, but life just keeps going forward. Life goes on. This world goes on. It doesn't end. It may end for a little while, and there are those, of course, that will mourn our passing. Those that loved us and we loved them, and those that cared for us and we cared for them. But at the same time, too, life moves forward. And that's really the way it should be, and that's the way it ought to be, but it's sometimes it's very hard to swallow. Grief is real, and grief has a process, and in many ways we never get over it. We learn to deal with it a little bit better, really, but we never truly get over it completely. And so Solomon just says, though, just know it's going to get better. Life moves on, and grief can also be a process by which we go through at any loss, not just the loss of a friend, not just the loss of a loved one, but any loss of health, loss of job, loss of home, finances, any loss, grief comes. Solomon here is talking about life. Anything in those verses you'd like to talk about? So again, he reminds us a little differently, but he reminds us again, remember your Creator, verse 6, before the silver cord is loose. Remember your Creator before you pass. Remember your Creator before you pass from this life. The emptiness, really, of life without God, Solomon, I think, kind of speaks that right here. He says, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. Then the dust shall return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. There's times in which will pass, he says. He says, no, I think, here's some euphemistic expressions. Golden bowl is broken, the pitcher shattered, the wheel's broken at the well. You pass. But what happens then? Well, he reminds us the dust will return to the earth as it was. The body returns back to the dust of the earth. Whether that's through just being buried or whether you are embalmed, and if you are in the state of Tennessee, you're supposed to be embalmed now. If you're embalmed, you eventually will turn back to the dust of the earth, or whether, as many folks are beginning to do now, cremated. And of course, that's just a quicker way of getting there. But it says the body returns to the dust of the earth. The spirit returns to God. The spirit returns to God who gave it. And so it is interesting to note that Solomon truly believes that there is a physical aspect of man and there's a spiritual aspect. There's a part that lives but for a little while, and there's a part of us that lives forever. So Solomon says, as he closes out the thought in verse 8, vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all's vanity. It's empty. That's kind of a sad way of looking at life, isn't it? No. I think this is his conclusion, but I wonder to what extreme. I wonder, in other words, if we had Solomon here teaching class today, would he really say it's worthless? Or would he say there's a purpose, but it will come to an end? Because if you go through the first 7 verses, you kind of get his point. You get to the 8th verse and you say, boy, there's a cynical old man. That he's basically, maybe he's saying nothing, but what part do we play in the world where we are? In other words, not president of the United States, not going to be president of the United States, don't want to be president of the United States. But where have I affected the folks that I have come in contact with? How have I affected the folks that I've come in contact with? Have I made my part of the world a better place? That's what I think each of us have to ask. And that's what I try to ask myself quite often. How have I affected those that I come in contact with? Have I affected them in a better way? And if I have, I've done what I'm supposed to do. My life is all about, or should be all about, glorifying God. Well, you got to remember, probably not. Uh, but you also got to remember, here's a man that, in having much, saw much, and he seems to be, to me, a tremendous cynic.
All the things that
Matter.
are vain in life,
Yeah.
the search for happiness and pleasure and treasures and all those things, they mean nothing.
Right.
Don't matter. Nothing. What really matters is the next thing. God. That,
I'm wondering if that's not true, because let's think about this from this standpoint. Solomon is given great wealth in life, and he seemingly manages it. For what little we know, he manages it well, and that's the key. It's not having wealth; it's being able to manage it. But he has children coming after him, and he wants them to get the point. And you can look at it from this standpoint. Chapter 12, he's saying, you are going to die. But what has he already said? Remember God, right? Twice in one chapter. Remember God. Remember God. Keep God in your life. And so I would say this. At least he is pointing them in the right direction, right? And he's seemingly saying, you're going to make mistakes. I mean, he did. But at the same time, too, remember God. I wonder, don't you wonder? I do. Don't you wonder about when he wrote this, if he remembered, as he was trying to remind people, remember God, he thought about all of his mistakes that he made in life, all the bad decisions, the sin that we all commit. But if he thought about, you do better than I did. And don't we tell that to our children? I want you to do better than I did, right? I told Ethan, I want you to be a better parent than I was. He's doing a pretty good job. But I want you to do better than I did. And so we want that. And maybe that's part of it. Anything else? Good point. I don't know. I don't know. That'd be hard to say. Maybe, but how many of us live under grace now and have the same feelings? Have the same feelings that he has, that live under grace? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not there. I guess I'll get there maybe if I live long enough, but I don't think like he thinks exactly. And some of that, what he said, but then I also wonder, like, Lazarus said he wanted to go back, right?
Right.
Like, but anybody else, you first listen to old person tell him how it is, or we make more progress, right? You wouldn't chase it as hard because at the end when you die, surely everything is like meaningless as far as personal gain, right? It's really gone. Wherever it goes.
Yeah, that's what he said.
So I guess maybe it's not old enough to be where he's at. Maybe I'll get there, maybe I'll understand it when I'm 85, that's almost 60.
Well, remember what he said. He said, "There's nothing new under the sun," and so it doesn't change. Yeah, you get to where, and I'm going to make a general statement that doesn't always apply, but I'm going to make it in a statement that it sounds like it applies to everybody. I've sat with a lot of in ministry. I've been fortunate enough, and you can look at this one of two ways. I've been fortunate enough the way I've looked at it to sit with a lot of folks, a lot of shut-ins, a lot of folks in their older years, their senior years. And when you slow down and when you look and realize all the fights, if you will, and I use that in a broad term just from a standpoint of disappointments in life, you become hardened. And this is one thing that as a preacher, and I've talked to a lot of older preachers, that I've come to the understanding that you really have to fight. I have a preacher friend that I talked to this week. He turned 63 years old this week. He's actually a roommate of mine in college. The congregation doesn't know where he preaches. The congregation doesn't know what I'm fixing to tell you because the elders failed to tell the congregation. But about 3 or 4 years ago, they brought in a young man for summer work. They told the elders sat down with the preacher and said, he will preach these Sundays. And the preacher said, now, that may not be when my vacation jives and meetings and we'll have, no, he will preach these Sundays. And if you're gone any of the other times, he will preach those as well. Okay. So then by the end of the summer, they announced that basically the young man would be coming back next summer because he would be graduating from college from Freed-Hardeman. And they would hire him full time as the associate minister. In the meantime, they come in with the preacher and they give him a new contract. And basically, without getting in all the wherefores and the whereases, this past Sunday was his last Sunday to preach on a Sunday morning. The elders have told him he will not preach anymore on Sunday mornings, that this young man will be, he had been preaching most of the time anyway, the young man had, and not my old roommate. But they told, the contract said that my roommate would not preach any Sundays after this Sunday. This next year, he'll only preach on Sunday nights. That will be the only time he'll preach for them. And it won't be every Sunday night, it's just some. And then that's in 2023. And in 2024, he will not be there. They will pay him a year's salary, but he will not be there. And in other words, they fired him and they've given him 2 or 3 years to kind of get his affairs in order. But they pushed him out. I talked to him this week, and you can imagine he is hurt. He is cynical beyond belief and very mad at the elders. And the elders haven't announced all that to the congregation. They haven't even told the congregation anything. And so the folks don't know, And so it's sad. And so you fight all these fights in life, and not just preachers. Everybody has all these things they go through in life. And as you get older and you sit down and you go through all those things, it's hard not to be hard. And I've watched folks fight that. And that's one thing I'm going to fight, is try not to be hard when you get to sit down and look at all of it. But I'm wondering if that's not in Solomon's life. I don't know. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
he was talking about, I know he was talking about Christopher and Ashton, probably not the most all that.
Yeah, no. Yeah, we understand. Yeah.
I know guys that did, but I know some other guys that are in their late 70s.
Oh, yeah.
Really great, but I'll walk building 2 or 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And they're not really sensitive.
I just think you have to fight it. I think you have to not fight it, realize it. Yeah.
They active. I mean, your buddy can go get him another job.
I told him that, and he's got some issues that are some problems, but I've told him that. I've told him that on more than one occasion. So. No, I don't either. I don't either. Well, well,
So, I mean, I think you mental health treatment, that's a sweet deal.
If you
Wait.
did your maximum unemployment. Well, if I remember right, anyway.
we as preachers, though, and I've said this many times, we as preachers are half crazy anyway. There is within any good preacher what Jeremiah called a fire. Jeremiah said, there's a fire in my bones. And with any good preacher, there's a fire. That not necessarily am I better than you at doing it, but I just have a message that I want to share, and I want to share with others. And I have a ministry that as long as I can do what I'm doing to help others, I know of a lady that used to be a professional entertainer. She's passed away now. But even on weekends, she and her husband would go back to Arkansas every weekend. And there was some little get together, some hole in the wall or something. I don't think it was a bar. I think it was just some, like a convention center or what I'm talking about. But anyway, they would go and they would play. And they would play, they'd leave on Thursday, get there Friday and Saturday, and play on Friday and Saturday, and come back Sunday afternoon and get back in time for church Sunday night. And the question was asked, why do you do it? And she said, that feeling of acceptance, of hearing people clap and like what you do, keeps me going the rest of the week. And for a preacher to get together a sermon and hear members say thank you or appreciate that or like that or that helped me, or maybe even not to say anything, but to know that you preached the best you could. And then during the week to have the opportunity to call somebody, to send a card to somebody, to go help somebody by doing something for them, and them to say thank you. As preachers, that's kind of what we're trained to do, and to still be able to do that and to feel useful even well after 65 and 67 just means a lot. It is a little different than working down at a factory or store or for a business. It's just a little different. And I know it's different, but that's why that sweet deal as a preacher is not that sweet. Anything else? Because the reality of it is we don't have a 9-to-5 job. 8 to 5. I mean, I go home at night and read, study a lot, write a lot, but I enjoy it. And most preachers do. But all preachers are different. Some preachers are heavy into service. Some preachers are excellent at being pulpit guys. Some preachers are excellent at PR. Some are excellent in all of those areas. I'm still looking for my talents. I'll find them one day. That's why y'all hired me, right? So help Paul out, figure out what he can do. Missy's going to. And I appreciate that. I really do. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, I think they should have done that. I think they should have gone to the congregation and said, "This is what we've decided. This is what we've done," and I think they should have included him in a discussion of why they were doing what they were doing.
I
Yeah,
think she's doing a great job.
yeah,
Just want somebody younger than you.
yeah,
And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, age discrimination. There's age discrimination in the church. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and there is a difference in preaching, and we're getting into preaching, not Solomon. There is a difference in preaching and working for a company. Okay. And here's the difference. The difference is you pour your life into it. You love the people. You love what's going on. You like say you love what you're trying to help and what you're trying to build. And at the same time too, uh, to have that pulled away from you and pulled out from under you, you know, it stings. It stings a lot. And so that's uh, that's one of those things that you have to stop and think about. Preaching, like I say, preaching's different. Preaching's different than say working. Uh, I worked at an industry for 11 months. Y'all know that, and enjoyed it, appreciate it. But it's a whole lot different than you go in there and our time. We didn't have time cards. We had fingerprint, and so you go in there and of course it registers what time you've clocked in, what time you clocked out, and who you are and what you look like and all that fun stuff. But it's very different, very different. Anything else? All right, Ecclesiastes 12, beginning in verse 9. Moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. He arranged many proverbs. The preacher he kind of refers back to himself. He hasn't done this in a while, but we understand he's talking about himself. The preacher sought to find acceptable words. And what was written was upright, words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. And further, my son, be admonished by these of making many books, there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. The fact that God's word does prick us, and maybe he's saying, and it just seems like to me, Solomon's saying, this might hurt. This might not be what you like. This may not be what you want. This may not be something that you appreciate. And he talks about the verse 11, the words of the wise are like goads. Well, I think we know what a goad is. A goad is usually something, a lot of times a stick with a sharp end, or maybe a stick. Sometimes a shepherd would carry a stick that would have several nails on the end, and if the sheep weren't going where he wanted the sheep to go, he'd kind of nudge them, convince them to go in this way with that. And so Solomon seemingly is saying that these things may hurt, but he goes on to say, he says, look in verse 12, and further, my son, be admonished by these of making many books, there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. Isn't that true? Well, there's a lot of books written, a lot of books written today that can tell you everything. Now, it's interesting because our generation, so to speak, we read a book, right? Younger generation doesn't read a book. You know what they do? YouTube. That's right. Watch the video. And I'll be honest, YouTube is helpful in a lot of different ways, especially if, I don't want to buy it today. I don't want to buy a $20 book to only get 2 thoughts out of when I can watch a 2-minute video, right? Big difference. Big difference. I value my life and the time that I have. But Solomon's still, he still wants, and God wants his word taught. And he wants folks to believe it. And so finally, he says, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Here's what it's all about. And that's what I hear Solomon saying. Here's what it's all about. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is man's all. This is what man's supposed to do. What's he supposed to do? He's supposed to, if he's going to make his life count for something, he's got to fear God. If he's going to make it mean something, fear God, not from the standpoint of fear as in afraid of, but fear from the standpoint of respect. And when we respect God and we respect his teachings, respect his word, then what are we going to do? We're going to do what he says, right? You gotta have that respect for God. And so Solomon says, you fear God, you keep his commandments. And then he goes on to say, look in verse 14, for God will bring every work into judgment. For life really to count. If I were going to preach a sermon on this, if you said, Paul, preach a sermon on this next Sunday, and I said, okay, here's what I would entitle it. For life to count. For life to count, there's 3 things. First of all, fear God. Second of all, keep his commandments. And thirdly, verse 14, prepare for the judgment. Prepare for what's coming. Why? Because he says, look at the last part of verse 14. He's talking about every work of the judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. It'll be brought to account. And so Solomon's arrangement of life is making life count. He says, as he gets to the conclusion, he says, you need to do these 3 things. These are important. Anything else, that it's added. It's added.
Leave the answer in that statement that Steve comes out.
Yeah.
Later on, because if you look at it, it says preacher.
Yeah.
He doesn't refer to himself in the first person there.
Right. But he did earlier on.
He did. Somebody read the book and said, "Here's what I found in it."
Yeah.
I read all this and talk about the vanity of life, but the true message of Ecclesiastes is those last verses.
Right. Yeah. That's always been the critical, as we call it, the critical aspect of judging the text and trying to figure out exactly whether it was written by Solomon or not. It's always been that great discussion over that. Good question.
That's all.
Yeah. It does. I want you, though, to go back and read this book. And I want you to read it not from the standpoint of the hardness of heart and the cynicism. I want you to read it more from the standpoint of the young man and what advice he's trying to give the young man. Write yourself a few notes down. And then go back and put the glasses on of an older person and read it from the standpoint of an older person and see what you learn in that regards. And see if the two mesh. So read it through from different perspectives and see. Yeah, you can look at, and I've tried to look at Solomon from the standpoint of a young man or an old man, and it is hard to figure out exactly what he's saying. But it is interesting. I think an interesting point was made by somebody I read, and it was this. It was Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes talked about and said in some ways, even though vanity of vanities, he said, enjoy life. He never in this book said, enjoy sin. That's an interesting take. It's truth. It is true. Enjoy life. But he never said, enjoy sin. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, for the many blessings of it. Thankful that you love us and watch out for us and keep us. Thankful for the fact that you've given us life. You've given us an opportunity to be here, the health and strength that we have to be able to assemble together. And we ask your richest blessings as we go into our worship service, that we'll truly worship you in spirit and in truth. We ask that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Have a great week.